beyond the reach of imperial borders, where grasslands stretched without division or wall. Decisions were made in silence. Riders passed low fires at dusk, their movements steady, their intent unreadable. Horses were not possessions. They were extensions of thought, trained for speed, for distance, for war. Settlements came and went with the seasons, but alliances lingered, negotiated with gesture and oath more than with law. There was no court, no capital, only gatherings, councils, and the weight of reputation. The Huns watched more than they spoke. And when they moved, it was with precision, not chaos. Before Attila was feared, he was understood, as someone shaped by this world, not separate from it. What followed was not sudden. It was the outcome of preparation. Long before Attila, the world was already breaking. Empires trembled, and the horsemen of the East were watching. In the dying light of the 4th century, the empire stretched across 3 continents like a wounded giant, its limbs twitching with the memory of former strength. From Hadrian's Wall in Britain to the cataracts of the Nile, from the Atlantic shores of Spain to the desert fortresses of Mesopotamia, imperial eagles still cast their shadows over 100 million souls. Yet anyone with eyes to see could recognize that this vast dominion was no longer the invincible machine that had once devoured kingdoms and reshaped continents according to its will. 8 centuries of imperial endurance were fracturing along fault lines that no amount of imperial will could repair. In 285 AD, Emperor Diocletian had acknowledged what many had long suspected. The civilized world had grown too vast, too complex, and too troubled for any single man to govern effectively. His division of the empire into eastern and western halves, each ruled by its own Augustus with subordinate Caesars, had been intended as a solution to administrative overstretch. Instead, it had institutionalized the fragmentation that would ultimately destroy unity forever. By the middle of the 4th century, these 2 halves had developed into distinct entities with their own armies, their own bureaucracies, and increasingly, their own interests. Western territories, including modern Italy, France, Spain, Britain, and parts of Germany and the Balkans, answered to Ravenna after the Eternal City itself became too dangerous. From Constantinople's magnificent walls, Eastern emperors governed Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt, lands that were generally more prosperous, more defensible, and less troubled by barbarian incursions. Among the most visible signs of imperial decline was a military crisis that plagued both empires. Legendary legions that had once marched from victory to victory across 3 continents were now shadows of their former selves. Recruitment had become increasingly difficult as citizens grew reluctant to serve in armies that offered little glory and enormous danger. Gone was the professional military class that had been the backbone of imperial expansion, replaced by barbarian federati, allied tribes who served in exchange for land, money, and the promise of citizenship. More than just a change in recruitment policy, this transformation from a citizen army into a barbarian mercenary force reflected fundamental demographic and economic changes reshaping the empire from within. Urban centers that had been the glory of civilization were declining as trade routes became unsafe and economic production shifted from manufacture to subsistence agriculture, with land going out of cultivation and commerce contracting. Tax revenues that had supported the massive bureaucracy and military establishment were steadily eroding. Compounding these economic pressures was a monetary crisis that had been building for generations. Silver content in coins had been steadily debased as emperors struggled to finance their armies and bureaucracies with inadequate resources. Inflation had made imperial currency nearly worthless in many regions, forcing a return to barter systems that further disrupted long-distance trade. Sophisticated economic networks that had once linked Britain with India and Spain with China were fragmenting into localized systems that could barely support their own populations. Perhaps most troubling of all was a spiritual crisis that gripped the civilized world. Ancient gods who had guided the empire to greatness seemed powerless against the challenges it now faced. Christianity's rise, while providing new sources of meaning and community for many, had also undermined traditional religious foundations of imperial authority. Christian emperors could no longer claim divine status in the old manner, while Christian subjects increasingly looked to bishops and saints rather than emperors for guidance and protection. Even as the empire struggled with these internal challenges, external pressures were mounting that would ultimately prove decisive in determining its fate. Along the northern and eastern frontiers, barbarian peoples were stirring with an energy and ambition that imperial diplomats and generals found increasingly difficult to contain or channel. Far from the primitive tribes that earlier generations had encountered, these were sophisticated warrior societies that had learned much from their contacts with civilization while retaining their own military traditions and social structures. Gothic peoples had been among the first to demonstrate the new realities of barbarian power. Originally dwelling north of the Black Sea, they had divided into two main groups: the Visigoths in the west and the Ostrogoths in the east. Both groups had developed formidable military capabilities through centuries of warfare, with neighboring tribes and occasional conflicts with imperial forces. Siege techniques and weaponry from the civilized world now served their purposes, while they maintained their traditional mobility and fierce warrior culture. Dwelling in the regions that would later be called Poland and Eastern Germany, Vandals had similarly evolved from simple raiders into an organized confederacy capable of coordinated military action across vast territories. Skill in both land and naval warfare would later enable them to conquer North Africa and establish a kingdom that would challenge imperial control of the Mediterranean for over a century. Along the Rhine frontier, Franks, Alemanni, and other Germanic tribes had maintained contact with civilization for centuries, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as allies, but always as independent peoples with their own goals and ambitions. Military and administrative techniques from the empire had been absorbed by these tribes while they developed their own distinctive forms of organization that combined traditional warrior values with the practical needs of governing settled populations. Controlling vast territories north of the Caucasus, Alans, a nomadic people related to the Sarmatians, had developed cavalry techniques that rivaled those of any contemporary military force. Superior horsemanship and mobility made them formidable opponents in open battle, while their nomadic lifestyle made them nearly impossible to defeat through traditional methods of campaign and occupation. But it was from the vast steppes beyond the edges of the known world that history's greatest challenge to imperial power would emerge. In endless grasslands that stretched from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific Ocean, nomadic peoples had been developing military and organizational capabilities that would soon transform the balance of power across the entire Eurasian landmass. These were the lands that had given birth to the Scythians, the Sarmatians, and other horse-riding peoples who had periodically erupted into the settled world with devastating effect. Steppe nomads lived a life that seemed almost incomprehensible to citizens accustomed to urban civilization and settled agriculture. They followed their herds across vast distances, living in felt tents that could be assembled and disassembled in minutes, owning no permanent property beyond their animals and weapons. Yet this apparent simplicity concealed sophisticated skills in warfare, diplomacy, and organization that made them among the most formidable military forces in the world. Every nomad was a warrior from childhood, learning to ride before he could walk properly and to shoot arrows from horseback before he reached adolescence. Demands of nomadic life, protecting herds from predators and raiders, competing for scarce grazing land, migrating across hundreds of miles of dangerous territory, created a population of natural soldiers who were tough, mobile, and utterly fearless in battle. Social organization of nomadic societies was perfectly adapted to military needs. Tribal structures based on kinship and personal loyalty could be rapidly transformed into military units when warfare required. Skills needed to coordinate the movement of thousands of animals across vast distances could be applied to the deployment and supply of armies. Nomadic emphasis on individual prowess and group cohesion created military forces that combined personal courage with unit discipline in ways that sedentary armies found difficult to match. Around the year 370 AD, these abstract possibilities became terrifying realities when a nomadic people called the Huns erupted from the eastern steppes and began moving westward with a speed and violence that caught the entire barbarian world unprepared. Unlike any enemy that Europeans had previously encountered, they seemed to appear from nowhere, strike with devastating effect, and vanish before any effective response could be organized. The first victims of Hunnic expansion were the Alans, whose own cavalry skills proved inadequate against the superior mobility and archery of the newcomers. The Alan Confederation, which had dominated the steppes north of the Caucasus for generations, simply disintegrated under Hunnic pressure. Some Alan groups were absorbed into the Hunnic forces, while others fled westward to seek refuge among Gothic and other barbarian peoples. The destruction of Alan power sent shockwaves throughout the barbarian world, but it was only the beginning. The Huns next turned their attention to the Ostrogoths, whose kingdom, under Ermanaric, had been one of the most powerful barbarian states of the 4th century. Ostrogothic resistance crumbled with shocking speed, as Hunnic cavalry tactics proved devastatingly effective against Gothic infantry and heavy cavalry. The fall of the Ostrogothic kingdom created a refugee crisis that would have profound implications for the Roman Empire. Thousands of Gothic warriors and their families fled westward, seeking new homes and safety from the Hunnic terror that had destroyed their homeland. These refugees, led by chieftains like Fritigern and Alavievus, approached the Roman authorities seeking permission to cross the Danube and settle within imperial territory. Imperial response to this crisis revealed both the empire's weakness and the complexity of the challenges it faced. Emperor Valens, ruling the Eastern Empire from Constantinople, saw an opportunity to gain new recruits for his armies while solving the Gothic refugee problem. He granted permission for the Goths to cross the Danube, but imperial administration proved incapable of managing the massive population movement that followed. Settlement process quickly degenerated into chaos, as corrupt officials exploited the desperate refugees while failing to provide the supplies and security they had promised. Gothic resentment grew as their families faced starvation, while imperial merchants profited from their misery. When fighting finally broke out between Gothic refugees and imperial forces, it escalated rapidly into a full-scale war that would demonstrate the vulnerability of the military system. Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD became one of the most catastrophic defeats in imperial history. Emperor Valens led a large army against Gothic forces that had been joined by other barbarian groups and some disaffected troops. Fighting began with a cavalry charge that was repulsed by Gothic spearmen, but the decisive moment came when additional Gothic cavalry forces arrived on the battlefield and struck the imperial army in the flank. Imperial defeat was so complete that it shocked the entire ancient world. 2/3 of the army was destroyed, including most of its officers and many of its best soldiers. Emperor Valens himself died in the fighting, though his body was never recovered from the carnage. Eastern military power was shattered, leaving vast territories defenseless against further barbarian incursions. Aftermath of Adrianople demonstrated how completely the balance of power had shifted between civilization and the barbarian peoples. New Eastern Emperor Theodosius I was forced to negotiate a treaty with the Goths that granted them federate status within the empire, essentially recognizing them as an autonomous people who would provide military service in exchange for territory and subsidies. This agreement established a precedent that would be repeated throughout the empire as imperial weakness forced accommodation with barbarian strength. Yet even as these dramatic events unfolded in the Balkans, Huns themselves remained largely mysterious to imperial observers. Classical historians like Ammianus Marcellinus struggled to describe a people whose lifestyle and customs seemed to defy understanding. Huns were portrayed as inhuman monsters who lived on horseback, ate raw meat, and knew nothing of agriculture or settled life. These descriptions, while obviously exaggerated, reflected the genuine incomprehension with which citizens viewed a nomadic society so different from their own urban civilization. Reality of Hunnic society was far more complex than imperial stereotypes suggested. Huns had developed sophisticated political and military institutions that enabled them to coordinate the activities of numerous tribal groups across vast territories. Their leaders, known as kings or chiefs, possessed real authority that was based on military success, diplomatic skill, and the ability to distribute wealth among their followers. Their way of war merged age-old adaptability with fresh strategies designed to outmaneuver more static enemies. Composite bows, crafted from horn, wood, and sinew, could drive arrows through imperial armor at ranges that standard weapons could not match. Mobility allowed them to choose when and where to fight, avoiding unfavorable engagements while concentrating overwhelming force at decisive points. Perhaps most importantly, Huns had learned to use terror as a weapon of war. Sudden appearances, brutal treatment of captured enemies, and apparent invincibility created psychological effects that often proved more decisive than their actual military capabilities. Cities surrendered without siege, armies fled without fighting, and entire peoples abandoned their homelands rather than face Hunnic attack. Under leaders like Uldin and later Charaton, Huns began to establish more permanent bases along the Danube frontier, transforming from nomadic raiders into a regional power that could not be ignored by imperial diplomacy. These early Hunnic leaders learned to play politics, sometimes allying with one faction against another, sometimes threatening invasion unless tribute was paid, always maintaining the initiative in their relationships with imperial authorities. The Roman response to the Hunnic emergence revealed the strategic confusion that plagued imperial policy during this period. Sometimes Roman generals hired Hunnic warriors as mercenaries against other barbarian enemies. Sometimes they attempted to organize coalitions of barbarian peoples against Hunnic expansion. Sometimes they simply paid tribute and hoped that Hunnic attention would be directed elsewhere. This inconsistent policy reflected deeper problems within the Roman governmental system. The division between Eastern and Western empires meant that coordinated responses to empire-wide threats were nearly impossible to organize. The frequent changes of emperors, often through military coups or assassinations, prevented the development of long-term strategic planning. The corruption and incompetence that plagued the imperial bureaucracy made effective implementation of any policy extremely difficult. By the opening years of the 5th century, the world into which Attila would be born had been fundamentally transformed by the events of the previous decades. The Roman Empire, while still massive and wealthy by any historical standard, was clearly in decline and increasingly dependent on barbarian federate troops for its defense. The barbarian peoples who had once lived on the empire's margins had become major players in European politics, with some groups established as kingdoms within former Roman territories. Most significantly, the Huns had emerged as the dominant military power in Eastern Europe, controlling territories that stretched from the Caucasus to the Carpathians, and exercising influence that extended far beyond their direct rule. The nomadic confederation that they had created was unlike anything that had previously existed in European history, a mobile empire that could project power across vast distances while remaining largely immune to the counterattacks that had eventually destroyed other barbarian kingdoms. The stage was set for the emergence of a leader who could harness this unprecedented concentration of nomadic power and direct it toward goals that would shake the foundations of the civilized world. The child who would become known as Attila the Hun was about to be born into a world where traditional boundaries between civilized and barbarian, settled and nomadic, had already begun to dissolve. The empire that had once seemed eternal was discovering its mortality, while peoples who had once seemed primitive were demonstrating capabilities that would reshape the map of Europe. From the dying edges of empire they came, riders with no thrones to serve, no cities to protect, and no dread of the grave. In the courts of Ravenna and Constantinople, emperors counted their gold and wondered how much it would cost to buy another year of peace. On the endless steppes beyond the Danube, a new generation of nomadic leaders was learning to read the weakness of settled peoples and to dream of conquests that would dwarf anything their ancestors had accomplished. The world was waiting, though it did not yet know it, for the coming of the scourge of God. Before he was a scourge, he was a student, raised in a world of blood oaths, horse lords, and imperial tribute. Into this world of shifting allegiances and crumbling frontiers, sometime around 406 AD, two brothers were born who would reshape the destiny of Europe. Attila and Bleda emerged as heirs to a nomadic confederation that had already proven its ability to terrorize empires. Yet their inheritance was far more complex than simple military might. They entered a world where the balance between civilization and barbarism had been fundamentally altered, where gold flowed from treasuries to nomadic camps, and where the ancient certainties that had governed relations between the empire and the steppes no longer applied. Growing up in the shadow of their uncle Rua, known to imperial authorities as Rugila, both boys learned that leadership among the Huns required far more than traditional nomadic skills. While other children of the steppes mastered horsemanship and archery, the brothers received an education that encompassed the arts of diplomacy, the complexities of politics, and the delicate calculations required to extract maximum advantage from the weakness of settled peoples. Under Rua's guidance, their confederation had evolved from a loose alliance of raiding tribes into something approaching a primitive state, with permanent diplomatic relationships, regular tribute arrangements, and increasingly sophisticated administrative structures. Rua himself represented a new type of nomadic leader, one who understood that the greatest victories could be won without ever drawing a sword. Since assuming leadership of the nomadic alliance around 420 AD, he had transformed the relationship between his people and the empire from sporadic raiding to systematic exploitation. Where earlier Hun leaders had sought quick plunder and withdrawn to the steppes, Rua established a permanent presence along the Danube frontier that forced both Eastern and Western authorities to treat him as an equal, rather than a barbarian nuisance. Central to Rua's strategy was his sophisticated understanding of imperial weaknesses and divisions. Authorities in Constantinople and Ravenna were so focused on their mutual rivalry that they often failed to coordinate their responses to external threats. Rua learned to play one empire against the other, offering his services as an ally to whichever side offered better terms, while threatening devastating raids against those who proved insufficiently generous. His negotiations with diplomats revealed a shrewd intelligence that had absorbed lessons from decades of interaction with administrative practices. Under Rua's leadership, Hun military organization had evolved far beyond traditional nomadic raiding patterns. While maintaining the mobility and archery skills that made Hun warriors so formidable, the alliance had begun incorporating siege techniques, engineering knowledge, and tactical innovations learned from defeated enemies and allied contingents. Deserters and Gothic refugees brought expertise in siege warfare and urban assault that complemented traditional strengths in open battle and psychological warfare. Most significantly, Rua had established the principle that the empire should pay regular tribute to ensure Hun neutrality. This represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between the steppes and the settled world, transforming the Huns from external raiders into a regional power that demanded recognition and compensation for maintaining peace. Gold flowed northward across the Danube in increasing quantities, funding the expansion of military capabilities while creating economic dependencies that made peaceful relations essential for survival. For young princes, this environment provided an education in power that few rulers of any era would match. They learned to read the subtle signs of weakness, to distinguish between genuine military threats and diplomatic bluffs, and to calculate the precise amount of pressure required to extract concessions without provoking desperate resistance. Their uncle's court became a laboratory for studying the psychology of settled peoples, where ambassadors, Gothic refugees, and Alan allies provided daily lessons in the hopes, fears, and limitations of non-nomadic societies. Sources suggest that both siblings may have spent time as hostages in courts, a common diplomatic practice that served multiple purposes for both sides. Such arrangements provided guarantees of good behavior, while offering young barbarian nobles exposure to customs, languages, and administrative practices. If these accounts are accurate, the heirs would have received educations that few citizens of their generation could match, learning Latin and possibly Greek, studying law and military science, and observing firsthand the internal divisions and weaknesses that plagued governance. Whether through formal hostage arrangements or less structured diplomatic contacts, both princes clearly acquired sophisticated knowledge of politics and society that would prove invaluable in their later careers. The younger brother, in particular, developed an understanding of psychology that enabled him to manipulate fears and ambitions with devastating effectiveness. His later negotiations with representatives would demonstrate not just intelligence, but a deep appreciation for the cultural assumptions and political pressures that shaped decision-making. As the siblings matured, differences in their personalities and approaches to leadership became increasingly apparent. Bleda, the elder, seemed more inclined toward traditional nomadic values and military solutions to political problems. Contemporary sources describe him as a capable warrior and a charismatic leader among the Hun nobility, but suggest that he lacked the subtle intelligence and strategic vision that distinguished his younger brother. The future scourge, by contrast, demonstrated early signs of the calculated ruthlessness and psychological insight that would make him legendary. Even as a young man, he showed an unusual ability to inspire loyalty among diverse followers, while maintaining emotional distance from personal attachments that might compromise his political effectiveness. Where his sibling sought glory through martial prowess, the ambitious prince seemed more interested in the mechanisms of power itself, how it was acquired, maintained, and deployed to achieve specific objectives. When Rua died suddenly in 434 AD, possibly from lightning strike according to some accounts, the transition of power proceeded smoothly despite the potential for succession disputes that had plagued many nomadic confederations. Following established precedent, leadership passed jointly to both nephews, with the brothers sharing authority over their people in a partnership that seemed to promise continued stability and expansion. Initial signs suggested that dual leadership would prove effective. Both siblings possessed the military skills and political intelligence necessary for managing the complex relationships that sustained power, while their different temperaments and approaches complemented each other in many situations. The elder's popularity among traditional warriors balanced his brother's appeal to more sophisticated elements within the alliance, while their shared commitment to expanding influence provided a common agenda that minimized potential conflicts. Almost immediately after assuming power, the new leaders demonstrated their intention to continue and expand their uncle's policies of systematic exploitation of weakness. Rather than simply maintaining existing tribute arrangements, they began pressing for increased payments and additional concessions that would extend influence deeper into territory. Their negotiations with representatives revealed both the sophistication of their political understanding and their determination to extract maximum advantage from desperation. In 435 AD, the joint rulers achieved one of their most significant early diplomatic victories with the Treaty of Margus, negotiated with representatives of the Eastern Empire. This agreement represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between the Huns and Constantinople, transforming what had been irregular tribute payments into a systematic annual subsidy that acknowledged power as a permanent feature of regional politics. Authorities agreed to pay £700 of gold annually to ensure neutrality, while also accepting restrictions on their own diplomatic activities and trade relationships. Beyond the immediate financial benefits, this treaty established important precedents that would shape future negotiations. Recognition of territorial claims along the Danube frontier legitimized permanent presence in regions that had previously been considered spheres of influence. Provisions requiring the return of refugees and the prohibition of alliances with other barbarian peoples acknowledged that the Huns had achieved a status approaching equality with the empire itself. Perhaps most significantly, the treaty demonstrated the extent to which policy had become reactive rather than proactive in dealing with barbarian threats. Rather than developing long-term strategies for managing or eliminating external challenges, authorities had essentially adopted a policy of appeasement that postponed immediate crises while creating conditions for even greater problems in the future. Each successful negotiation increased prestige among other barbarian peoples, while demonstrating the profitable rewards available to those who could effectively threaten interests. With tribute secured and their southern frontier stabilized, the co-rulers turned their attention to consolidating and expanding their authority over the diverse peoples who comprised their alliance. This process required delicate balancing of traditional nomadic values, with the administrative innovations necessary for governing settled populations and managing complex economic relationships. Under their leadership, the alliance began developing more sophisticated institutions for tax collection, military organization, and diplomatic coordination. Society during this period represented a unique synthesis of nomadic traditions, with adaptations drawn from contact with settled civilizations. While maintaining the mobility and military culture that had made their conquests possible, the group had begun developing permanent administrative centers, standardized procedures for tribute collection, and coordinated policies for managing relationships with subject and allied peoples. This institutional development occurred without sacrificing the flexibility and responsiveness that were essential for nomadic military effectiveness. Central to this evolution was the siblings' recognition that permanent success required more than military intimidation. Sustainable power demanded the creation of genuine advantages for peoples who chose to ally with the Huns rather than resist them. Leadership began offering protection services to vulnerable populations, trade opportunities for displaced merchants, and advancement possibilities for ambitious individuals who could contribute useful skills or knowledge to their enterprises. Policies proved particularly effective in attracting support from populations that had been marginalized or displaced by policies. Gothic refugees, Allan survivors, and various Germanic groups found opportunities within the system that had been denied them by authorities. Rather than simply absorbing these peoples as conquered subjects, leaders integrated them as partners in further expansion, creating a genuinely multinational force that combined the military traditions of numerous warrior cultures. Military innovations during this period reflected the alliance's increasingly diverse composition and expanding ambitions. Traditional cavalry tactics were enhanced by Gothic infantry techniques, Allan horse breeding knowledge, and Germanic weaponry traditions. Perhaps most importantly, the Huns began systematically incorporating siege warfare capabilities that would prove essential for future campaigns against fortified positions. With the help of foreign engineers, many of them prisoners, the nomads added siege weaponry to their arsenal without sacrificing their trademark mobility. Where earlier raids had been limited to attacking unfortified targets or starving out defenders through blockade, the Alliance now possessed the technical capabilities necessary for direct assault on major cities and fortresses. This development fundamentally altered the strategic balance between nomadic and settled forces, eliminating the defensive advantages that had previously protected urban populations from steppe raiders. As their military capabilities expanded, so did the joint rulers' territorial ambitions. Campaigns during the late 430s and early 440s extended influence into regions that had never before experienced nomadic control, while demonstrating their ability to coordinate complex operations across vast distances. These expeditions served multiple purposes. They provided opportunities for warriors to gain wealth and prestige. They eliminated potential threats to security, and they demonstrated to potential enemies and allies alike that their forces possessed offensive capabilities that could reach any target within several hundred miles of their core territories. Success in these campaigns attracted additional followers to their banner, while providing resources for further expansion. Captured wealth funded the acquisition of new weapons and equipment, while prisoners with useful skills were integrated into the growing administrative and technical apparatus. Most importantly, each victory enhanced the psychological impact of threats against future targets, often making actual military action unnecessary, as intimidated opponents chose submission over resistance. Even as external successes accumulated, tensions within the dual leadership arrangement were beginning to emerge. While both siblings shared credit for their achievements, their different approaches to leadership and their distinct visions for future development created subtle but growing conflicts over policy and priorities. These differences remained manageable as long as expansion continued and spoils remained abundant. But they established patterns of disagreement that would eventually prove irreconcilable. The elder's preference for traditional nomadic values and his close relationships with conservative elements within their forces sometimes conflicted with his siblings' more ambitious plans for institutional development and territorial expansion. Where the traditional warrior saw their alliance as an enhanced version of traditional nomadic society, The visionary increasingly envisioned something approaching a nomadic empire that could compete directly with settled powers on their own terms. These philosophical differences were complicated by practical questions about resource allocation and strategic priorities. The martial leader favored continued raids and tribute extraction that provided immediate benefits for the traditional warrior elite, while his brother showed greater interest in long-term investments in administrative infrastructure and technical capabilities that might not pay dividends for years or decades. Their different personalities and leadership styles also created distinct factions within their forces, with some supporters preferring the elders' more accessible and traditional approach, while others were attracted to the younger prince's visionary intelligence and ruthless effectiveness. By the early 440s, observers both within and outside their domain were beginning to recognize that the dual leadership arrangement was creating tensions that might eventually require resolution. While both siblings remained committed to expansion and neither showed any inclination toward open conflict, their competing visions for the future were becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile through compromise and consultation. The question was not whether these tensions would eventually reach a breaking point, but rather when and how the inevitable crisis would unfold. Still, for the moment, the peace remained fragile but functional. Their forces continued expansion under joint leadership, tribute continued to flow across the Danube, and both princes seemed content to postpone fundamental questions about their ultimate direction. All the world watched and waited, still largely unaware that one of these siblings would soon emerge as the sole leader of a force that would challenge the very foundations of civilized society. Raised in the saddle, fluent in threats and treaties, Attila learned to read empires like a hunter reads prey. The education that had begun in his uncle's court was nearly complete, and the student was about to become the master of a power that would make emperors tremble and nations flee before his advance. But first, there was the matter of his brother, and the question of whether the Hunnic Confederation was large enough for two such ambitious rulers. Beyond the Danube's muddy waters, a new kind of warfare was taking shape. No longer content with the seasonal raids that had characterized previous generations of nomadic leaders, the joint rulers of the Hun Confederation began implementing campaigns that combined traditional steppe mobility with systematic territorial conquest. Their early expeditions across the Balkans revealed a level of coordination and strategic planning that caught both Eastern and Western authorities completely unprepared for the devastation that would follow. During the late 430s, coordinated strikes against frontier settlements demonstrated the evolution of Hun military capabilities. Unlike the hit-and-run tactics that had made their predecessors famous, these operations involved sustained pressure against specific targets, sophisticated intelligence gathering, and the systematic exploitation of captured resources. Cities that had relied on distance and fortification for protection discovered that neither advantage could guarantee safety against enemies who combined nomadic speed with settled world siege techniques. Serdica, modern Sofia, became one of the first major urban centers to experience the new reality of Hun warfare. Rather than simply surrounding the city and demanding tribute, the attackers implemented a coordinated assault that utilized both traditional cavalry charges and innovative siege equipment operated by captured engineers. Citizens who had grown accustomed to buying their safety with negotiated payments found themselves facing an enemy that seemed more interested in demonstrating capability than in immediate profit. Following the fall of Serdica, imperial diplomats rushed to negotiate new arrangements that might satisfy Hun ambitions without requiring further military demonstrations. These discussions revealed the extent to which the balance of power had shifted along the Danube frontier, where previous agreements had treated the nomadic confederation as a useful but controllable ally. The new negotiations acknowledged their status as a regional power capable of independent action that could threaten the stability of entire provinces. In 441 AD, violations of the Treaty of Margus provided the pretext for a massive escalation in Hun military operations. Merchants operating under imperial protection had allegedly crossed into Hun territory and robbed tombs sacred to the nomadic confederation, while imperial authorities had failed to return fugitives as required by previous agreements. Whether these violations were genuine grievances or convenient excuses for expansion mattered less than the military response they justified. Margus itself, the city that had given its name to the treaty, became the first target of what would develop into the most devastating Balkan campaign in generations. Rather than attempting to negotiate or seeking alternative settlements, the defenders chose to resist, apparently believing that their fortifications and imperial support would prove adequate against nomadic assault. Their miscalculation would demonstrate to every other city in the region the futility of opposing Hun military power. Siege techniques employed against Margus revealed how completely nomadic warfare had adapted to the requirements of attacking fortified positions. Traditional catapults and battering rams were supplemented by more sophisticated equipment that showed clear influence from engineering knowledge acquired during previous campaigns. Perhaps more importantly, the attackers demonstrated patience and systematic planning that contradicted stereotypes about nomadic impatience and inability to sustain long-term operations. When Margus finally fell after weeks of siege, its destruction served multiple strategic purposes beyond simple conquest. The thoroughness of the city's demolition sent a clear message to other potential centers of resistance about the consequences of defying Hun demands. Simultaneously, the wealth captured during the assault funded further military operations, while providing concrete benefits for the warriors who had participated in the campaign. Nisus, birthplace of Constantine the Great and one of the most important cities in the northern Balkans, became the next major target of Hun expansion. With a population approaching 100,000 people and fortifications that had never been successfully breached by barbarian assault, the city represented both a valuable prize and a significant military challenge. Its capture would demonstrate Hun capability to take any target in the region, regardless of its historical significance or defensive strength. Siege operations against Nisus revealed the full extent of Hun military evolution since their arrival in Europe. Engineers operating captured equipment implemented systematic breaching operations, while nomadic cavalry maintained complete control over the surrounding countryside. Citizens found themselves trapped between the advancing siege works and the mobile forces that prevented any possibility of escape or external relief. Contemporary accounts describe the fall of Nisus as one of the most devastating urban disasters of the 5th century. When the city's walls were finally breached, the attackers demonstrated a level of organized destruction that went far beyond traditional sacking. Buildings were systematically demolished. Populations were either killed or enslaved according to predetermined plans, and the entire urban infrastructure was methodically destroyed to prevent any possibility of rapid reconstruction. What remains of Nisus tells a clear story of total destruction. Layers of ash and debris from this period suggest that the city was not merely conquered, but effectively erased as a functioning urban center. The psychological impact of such complete destruction extended far beyond the immediate vicinity. influencing the decisions of military commanders and civilian authorities throughout the Balkans about the wisdom of resistance versus negotiation. With Nisus eliminated, Hun forces began systematic operations against secondary targets throughout the region. Singidunum, modern Belgrade, fell after brief resistance that demonstrated the futility of opposing the nomadic military machine. Smaller cities and towns throughout Thrace and Moesia found themselves faced with impossible choices between destruction and submission, with most choosing surrender after witnessing the fate of communities that had chosen to fight. Far more than advances in siege methods, these campaigns demonstrated a deeper shift in military thinking. Hun forces demonstrated unprecedented ability to coordinate operations across vast distances, with different armies striking multiple targets simultaneously while maintaining strategic coherence. Communication systems that had originated in nomadic migration practices were adapted to provide real-time intelligence about enemy movements and changing tactical situations. What unfolded in the Balkans upended every notion of nomadic logistical weakness, proving such forces could operate with unexpected precision. Rather than living off immediate plunder and withdrawing when local resources were exhausted, the attacking forces maintained systematic supply lines that supported sustained operations far from their traditional grazing territories. Captured resources were efficiently organized and distributed according to predetermined plans that maximized their contribution to ongoing military operations. Integration of diverse military traditions became increasingly apparent as the campaigns progressed. Traditional Hun archery and cavalry tactics were supplemented by Gothic infantry formations, Allen reconnaissance techniques, and engineering knowledge derived from captured specialists. Rather than simply adding these elements to existing structures, the Confederation had developed hybrid tactical systems that maximized the advantages of each component while minimizing their individual limitations. Perhaps most significantly, the campaigns revealed sophisticated understanding of imperial psychology and decision-making processes. Rather than pursuing random destruction or seeking immediate territorial occupation, Hun operations were calculated to create maximum pressure on imperial authorities, while maintaining flexibility for future negotiations. Each victory demonstrated capability while preserving the possibility that further destruction might be avoided through appropriate concessions. In 443 AD, imperial desperation led to renewed negotiations that would fundamentally alter the relationship between the Eastern Empire and the Hun Confederation. Emperor Theodosius II, faced with military disasters that threatened the security of Constantinople itself, authorized diplomatic missions that were prepared to offer concessions far beyond anything previously contemplated. These discussions would establish precedents that acknowledged Hun power as a permanent feature of European politics. Terms agreed upon during these negotiations reflected the complete transformation of imperial barbarian relations since the beginning of Hun expansion. Annual tribute payments were doubled from 700 to 1,400 pounds of gold, while additional provisions granted the Confederation trading rights and diplomatic recognition that placed them on essentially equal footing with the empire itself. Imperial authorities also agreed to evacuate a strip of territory south of the Danube, creating a buffer zone that acknowledged Hun territorial sovereignty. Beyond immediate financial concessions, the new agreements included provisions that revealed imperial acceptance of Hun political legitimacy. Diplomatic protocols established permanent channels for communication between Constantinople and the Hun leadership, while trade arrangements created economic relationships that went far beyond simple tribute extraction. These institutional innovations transformed the Confederation from an external threat into a recognized neighbor, whose interests required ongoing consideration in imperial policymaking. Implementation of the new tribute arrangements required significant changes in imperial fiscal policy. The doubled payments represented a substantial portion of total governmental revenues, forcing reductions in other expenditures and creating economic pressures that affected every aspect of imperial administration. Citizens throughout the Eastern Empire found themselves bearing increased tax burdens, specifically designed to fund payments to their former enemies. More troubling for long-term imperial stability, the success of Hun pressure tactics encouraged other barbarian groups to adopt similar approaches to extracting concessions from imperial authorities. Vandal raids in North Africa, Gothic pressures along other frontier regions, and various smaller tribal movements all gained inspiration from the demonstration that systematic military pressure could produce substantial and permanent benefits from imperial weakness. During this period of external triumph, internal tensions within the Hun leadership structure were approaching a critical point. While both rulers had shared credit for military victories and diplomatic successes, their fundamental disagreements about future directions were becoming increasingly difficult to manage through consultation and compromise. The younger brother's growing reputation for strategic brilliance created pressures that challenged the traditional balance between the co-rulers. Choices between rival leaders increasingly reflected how military and tribal figures had fared under their command in the field. Those who had participated in siege operations showed increasing admiration for innovative tactical thinking, while others who preferred traditional nomadic warfare maintained loyalty to more conventional approaches. These factional divisions threatened to undermine the unity that had made Hun expansion possible. By 445 AD, the contradiction between joint leadership and the practical demands of governing an expanding confederation had become impossible to ignore. Military operations required clear chains of command. Diplomatic negotiations demanded consistent policy positions, and administrative functions needed unified direction. The system that had worked adequately during the early years of their rule was proving inadequate for managing the complex entity that their success had created. Circumstances surrounding the death of the elder brother remain unclear, though contemporary sources suggest that family tensions had reached a breaking point by the spring of 445. Whether through assassination, accident, or natural causes, his elimination resolved the leadership crisis in a manner that consolidated all authority in the hands of his younger sibling. The future scourge of Europe was now free to implement his vision without the constraints of shared power. Consolidation of sole authority occurred with remarkable speed and efficiency. Supporters of the deceased ruler were either eliminated, exiled, or absorbed into the new power structure according to their usefulness and reliability. Military commanders who had shown preference for traditional approaches found themselves replaced by officers whose loyalty was guaranteed by personal obligation rather than traditional clan relationships. Administrative positions were filled by individuals whose advancement depended entirely on continued service to the new regime. Transformation of Hun society under unified leadership reflected the ambitious vision that had been developing throughout the years of shared rule. Traditional nomadic structures were systematically reorganized to support the requirements of governing an increasingly diverse population spread across vast territories, while maintaining the mobility and military effectiveness that had made expansion possible. The Confederation began developing institutional capabilities that approached those of settled civilizations. Consolidating authority under a single leader led to immediate strides in how operations were planned and executed. Command structures were simplified and clarified, eliminating the consultation requirements that had sometimes slowed decision-making during critical moments. Intelligence gathering became more systematic, while logistical planning achieved new levels of sophistication that supported operations at greater distances and for longer durations than had previously been possible. The unification of leadership also reshaped diplomacy, changing the way imperial powers engaged with their counterparts. Rather than negotiating with representatives of a joint regime whose policy positions might change through internal consultation, imperial diplomats now faced a single authority whose decisions were final and whose commitments could be relied upon. This clarity actually improved the prospects for stable agreements, even as it concentrated unprecedented power in the hands of one individual. With his brother dead and his rivals kneeling, the sole ruler no longer rode as a warlord. He rode as a sovereign. The campaigns that had begun as extensions of traditional nomadic raiding had evolved into systematic conquest operations that threatened the foundations of imperial power. Cities that had stood for centuries were learning to calculate the cost of resistance versus the price of submission. Kings who had never feared barbarian assault were discovering that the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. Standing at the height of his power in 445 AD, the master of the Hun Confederation commanded resources and capabilities that dwarfed those available to any previous nomadic leader. Gold flowed into his treasury from imperial tribute and conquered cities, while his armies combined the military traditions of a dozen different peoples into a force that no contemporary power could match. The foundations had been laid for conquests that would make his early campaigns seem like mere preparation for the devastation that was to follow. Smoke still rose from the ruins of Nisus when Attila turned his gaze eastward toward richer prizes. Constantine's great city, the new Rome that had never fallen to barbarian assault, beckoned like a jewel beyond the horizon. Between the nomadic camps along the Danube and the golden domes of Constantinople lay a landscape dotted with cities that had grown fat on centuries of imperial prosperity, their citizens confident that massive walls and distant emperors would protect them from the chaos consuming the world beyond their gates. In the spring of 447, the Hun king unleashed a campaign that would shatter this confidence forever. Unlike the methodical sieges that had characterized his earlier operations, this assault combined the speed of traditional nomadic warfare with the systematic destruction that had become his signature. Cities that might have held out for months against conventional enemies found themselves overwhelmed within days by forces that seemed to anticipate their every defensive measure. Philippopolis, modern Plovdiv, commanded the approaches to the strategic passes through the Rhodope Mountains. Its capture would open the road to Thrace and the approaches to the imperial capital itself. Citizens who had watched the destruction of distant cities with detached concern suddenly found enemy scouts appearing on the hills surrounding their homes, moving with the easy confidence of hunters who had already chosen their prey. Rather than attempt a prolonged siege, the attackers implemented a strategy that had been perfected during years of warfare against fortified positions. Diversionary assaults drew defenders to the walls, while specialized teams infiltrated the city through routes that had been identified by careful reconnaissance. When dawn broke over Philippopolis, its citizens discovered that their enemies were already inside their supposedly impregnable defenses. What followed became a template for the systematic reduction of urban resistance throughout the Balkans. Rather than the chaotic sacking that had characterized earlier barbarian conquests, the destruction of Philippopolis proceeded according to predetermined plans that maximized both material gain and psychological impact. Specific buildings were targeted for preservation or demolition based on their strategic value, while populations were sorted according to their potential usefulness for future operations. Word of the city's fall spread faster than the smoke from its burning districts. Refugees streaming southward carried tales of destruction so complete that many who heard them refused to believe such devastation was possible. These accounts described not just military defeat, but the systematic erasure of a community that had existed for centuries, reduced to ash and memory in a matter of days. Arcadiopolis, strategically positioned to control access to the Gallipoli Peninsula, attempted to negotiate surrender before the attackers could demonstrate their siege capabilities. Envoys approaching the nomadic camp discovered a level of organization and sophistication that contradicted every stereotype about barbarian simplicity. The royal court they encountered operated with protocols and administrative efficiency that rivaled anything they had observed in Constantinople itself. Negotiations with the city's representatives revealed the cold calculation that now characterized the barbarian warlord's approach to diplomacy. Rather than simple demands for tribute or submission, the terms offered reflected sophisticated understanding of regional economics and strategic geography. Arcadiopolis would survive, but only as a carefully controlled asset in a larger strategic plan that encompassed the entire Eastern Mediterranean. Terms imposed upon the surrendering city established precedents that would influence future negotiations throughout the region. Beyond immediate tribute payments, the agreement included provisions for ongoing economic obligations, restrictions on military activities, and requirements for cooperation with nomadic administrative systems. These arrangements transformed conquered territories from temporary sources of plunder into permanent components of an expanding political structure. Success at Arcadiopolis opened the approaches to the most tempting prize of all. Constantinople's massive walls rose from the waters of the Bosphorus like a stone mountain, their foundations laid by Constantine himself and strengthened by generations of emperors who had understood that the city's survival depended on its ability to withstand any assault. Behind those walls lay wealth that dwarfed anything the nomadic confederation had previously encountered, accumulated through centuries of trade and taxation across 3 continents. Imperial authorities, watching the systematic reduction of their Balkan defenses, faced an impossible choice between military resistance and diplomatic accommodation. Emperor Theodosius II, whose reign had been characterized more by theological disputes than military campaigns, found himself confronting an enemy whose capabilities exceeded anything in his experience or that of his advisors. Previous barbarian threats had been manageable through traditional combinations of force, bribery, and political manipulation. But the power now approaching his capital seemed immune to such conventional responses. Desperate consultations in the imperial palace revealed the extent to which the Eastern Empire had become dependent on assumptions that no longer applied to the changing world beyond its borders. Military advisors who had spent their careers fighting other imperial armies or traditional barbarian raids struggled to develop strategies for confronting an enemy that combined nomadic mobility with sophisticated siege capabilities. Diplomatic experts found their carefully cultivated networks of barbarian allies either destroyed or co-opted by the advancing confederation. Rather than risk a siege that might destroy the greatest city in the Christian world, Theodosius chose negotiation. Imperial envoys who departed Constantinople for the nomadic camps carried with them authorization to offer concessions that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Their instructions reflected imperial recognition that the balance of power had shifted so dramatically that survival itself now required accommodation with former enemies. The conditions under which these negotiations proceeded demonstrated how completely the relationship between empire and barbarians had been transformed. Rather than imperial representatives dictating terms to subordinate tribal leaders, the discussions resembled diplomatic exchanges between equal powers. The nomadic court that received the imperial embassy operated with protocols and administrative sophistication that impressed even observers accustomed to the ceremonial grandeur of Constantinople itself. Priscus of Panium, the historian and diplomat who participated in these negotiations, left detailed accounts of his experiences in the nomadic court that provide unique insights into the character and methods of the man who had risen to dominate half of Europe. Rather than the savage barbarian of popular imagination, Priscus encountered a ruler whose intelligence and political sophistication exceeded that of most imperial administrators. His descriptions reveal someone who combined absolute authority with careful attention to the practical details of governance and diplomacy. Such personal observations recorded by Priscus challenge many contemporary assumptions about nomadic society and leadership. The royal residence, while mobile, incorporated elements of luxury and refinement that contradicted stereotypes about barbarian simplicity. Court ceremonies combined traditional steppe customs with innovations derived from contact with settled civilizations, creating hybrid institutions that reflected the Confederation's evolution from tribal alliance to regional empire. Most significantly, Priscus's accounts reveal the systematic intelligence gathering and strategic planning that characterized the conqueror's approach to regional politics. Rather than relying on intuition or traditional nomadic practices, decisions emerged from careful analysis of economic data, military capabilities, and political relationships that extended across the entire Eastern Mediterranean world. This level of administrative sophistication explained much about the unprecedented success of recent campaigns. Treaty negotiations that emerged from these diplomatic exchanges established terms that acknowledged the fundamental transformation of regional power relationships. When Emperor Theodosius II finally signed the agreement, the financial burden alone would have bankrupted smaller kingdoms. £6,000 of gold delivered immediately, with annual payments of £2,100 that represented nearly a tenth of the empire's entire budget. Beyond the crushing tribute, luxury goods would flow northward to the barbarian court. Silk garments, precious stones, and exotic spices that transformed nomadic camps into centers of unprecedented wealth. Worse than the financial hemorrhaging was the territorial humiliation that followed. For the first time in 1,000 years of imperial history, civilized territory was formally ceded to barbarian authority. Cities south of the Danube that had boasted Roman citizenship for generations found themselves abandoned by the government they had served, their populations left to navigate the alien customs and expectations of nomadic rule. Villages that had supplied grain to Constantinople now sent their harvests to feed the horses of their former enemies. Far beyond immediate financial and territorial concessions, the treaty included diplomatic provisions that transformed the Confederation from external threat to recognized regional power. Permanent embassy systems established ongoing channels for communication and dispute resolution, while trade agreements created economic relationships that went far beyond simple tribute extraction. These institutional innovations acknowledged that nomadic power had become a permanent feature of Mediterranean politics, rather than a temporary disruption to be managed and contained. Implementation of these new arrangements required fundamental changes in imperial administrative practices. Bureaucratic systems that had been designed to manage subordinate provinces and allied kingdoms were adapted to accommodate relationships with an equal power, whose territory bordered the empire's most sensitive regions. The psychological adjustment required for imperial officials to treat former enemies as diplomatic partners proved as challenging as the practical problems of implementing the new policies. Throughout the Eastern Empire, citizens struggled to comprehend the implications of their government's accommodation with barbarian power. Urban populations who had grown accustomed to imperial protection found themselves paying taxes specifically designed to fund tribute to their former enemies. Rural communities discovered that their security now depended as much on nomadic goodwill as on imperial military capabilities. The certainties that had structured daily life for generations were dissolving under pressure from forces that most people barely understood. Success of the Eastern campaigns established Attila's reputation as a leader who could deliver concrete results through a combination of military capability and diplomatic skill. Warriors who had followed him gained wealth and status far beyond anything their fathers had imagined possible, while subject peoples discovered that cooperation with nomadic authority could provide benefits that imperial rule had never offered. These practical demonstrations of effective leadership strengthened his position within the Confederation, while attracting additional followers from across the barbarian world. With the Eastern Empire subdued and tribute flowing westward across the Danube, Attila commanded resources that dwarfed those available to any previous nomadic leader. His royal court along the Tisza River had evolved into a genuine capital city that attracted diplomats, merchants, and scholars from across the known world. The confederation he ruled now controlled territories that stretched from the Caucasus to the Rhine, encompassing populations and resources that rivaled those of the greatest civilizations. The changes made in this time reflected a nuanced understanding of how to hold together a sprawling, multi-ethnic population. Traditional nomadic leadership structures were supplemented by administrative systems derived from imperial models, creating hybrid institutions that combined the flexibility of steppe society with the organizational capabilities of settled civilizations. These innovations enabled effective governance of territories far larger and more complex than any previous nomadic confederation had attempted to control. For a moment, the sole ruler of the Hun Confederation was more emperor than the men who wore the crown. Imperial gold filled his treasury, imperial diplomats sought his favor, and imperial armies avoided confrontation with his forces. The tribute that flowed from Constantinople exceeded the revenues of most kingdoms, while the territories under his control encompassed some of the richest and most strategic regions in Europe. He had achieved something that no barbarian leader before him had ever accomplished: the systematic subordination of imperial power to nomadic authority through a combination of military capability and diplomatic brilliance. Standing at the pinnacle of his eastern achievements in 450 AD, he commanded an empire that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, united under his personal authority and sustained by tribute from the greatest city in the world. But even as these triumphs were being consolidated, his attention was already turning westward toward new challenges and opportunities. The Western Empire, weakened by internal divisions and external pressures, beckoned with the promise of conquests that might surpass even his eastern achievements. The world was about to discover whether the methods that had subdued Constantinople could be applied with equal success to the ancient heart of imperial power in Italy itself. Winter had settled over the royal camp along the Tisza when an unexpected messenger arrived bearing a gift that would reshape the destiny of Europe. Princess Honoria, sister to Emperor Valentinian III and one of the most powerful women in the Western Empire, had smuggled a ring from her palace in Ravenna to the court of the man who had humbled the East. With it came a desperate plea, disguised as a marriage proposal, though what she truly sought was rescue from a political trap that threatened to destroy her influence forever. Honoria's predicament stemmed from the peculiar dynamics of Western imperial politics. where women of the royal family wielded enormous unofficial power while remaining legally subordinate to their male relatives. As Augusta and sister to the emperor, she commanded vast estates, controlled significant patronage networks, and influenced policy decisions that affected millions of subjects. Her mistake had been conducting an affair with her steward Eugenitus, a scandal that provided her enemies at court with the excuse they needed to eliminate her political influence. Faced with forced marriage to a senator who would effectively end her independence, the princess had conceived a desperate gambit that revealed both political sophistication and remarkable courage. Rather than submit to domestic exile, she chose to reach out to the most dangerous enemy of the empire, gambling that barbarian pragmatism might prove more accommodating than imperial family politics. Her message to Attila was carefully crafted to appeal to both his political ambitions and his appreciation for audacious planning. When Attila received the ring and its accompanying message, he recognized an opportunity that exceeded his most optimistic expectations. Here was a chance to claim legitimacy within the imperial system itself, to transform himself from external conqueror to rightful claimant of imperial authority. More practically, a marriage to the emperor's sister would provide legal justification for intervention in Western politics and territorial claims that could extend his influence far beyond anything achieved through pure military conquest. Rather than responding immediately to the princess's proposal, the Hun king spent months crafting a diplomatic strategy that would maximize the political benefits of this unexpected development. His demands, when they finally arrived in Ravenna, shocked imperial authorities with their scope and audacity. Beyond marriage to Honoria, he claimed half the Western Empire as her legitimate dowry, arguing that imperial law entitled her to an equal share of her father's inheritance alongside her brother. Imperial response to these demands revealed the complete transformation of barbarian civilized relations since the beginning of Hun expansion. Where previous generations of emperors had dismissed barbarian claims with contempt, Valentinian III found himself forced to take Attila's proposals seriously. The military capabilities demonstrated in the East made rejection potentially catastrophic, while acceptance would legitimize barbarian authority over imperial territory in ways that could destroy the theoretical foundations of imperial rule. Consultation with advisors produced no satisfactory resolution to the dilemma posed by the Hun marriage demand. Legal scholars argued that Honoria's status as Augusta did indeed entitle her to substantial inheritance rights, while military commanders warned that war with Attila would likely result in the same devastation that had overwhelmed the eastern provinces. Diplomatic experts suggested various compromise proposals, but none addressed the fundamental problem that any accommodation would establish precedents that other barbarian leaders might seek to exploit. Months of internal debate finally produced a rejection of Attila's demands that attempted to minimize the risk of military retaliation. Imperial envoys who delivered this response explained that Honoria's previous engagement precluded marriage to the Hun king, while her status as a woman prevented her from inheriting imperial territory. These legalistic arguments were supplemented by offers of increased tribute and trade concessions designed to provide alternative benefits that might satisfy barbarian ambitions without compromising imperial sovereignty. Attila's reaction to this rejection combined genuine outrage with calculated political theatre. He declared himself the champion of Honoria's legitimate rights, casting his coming invasion not as barbarian aggression, but as a righteous crusade to restore imperial law and justice. This narrative transformation proved crucial for maintaining unity within the Hun Confederation, where some leaders had questioned the wisdom of attacking the Western Empire, while tribute from the East continued to flow steadily. Preparation for the Western campaign required mobilization on a scale that exceeded anything Attila had previously attempted. The forces assembled for the invasion of Gaul represented not just Hun tribal levies, but a truly international army that included warriors from across the barbarian world. Ostrogoths under King Theodoric, Gepids under King Ardaric, various Germanic tribes, and Alan survivors all contributed contingents to an army that contemporary sources numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Creation of this massive coalition required diplomatic skills that rivaled Attila's military capabilities. Each allied group had its own motivations for joining the expedition, from hope of plunder to fear of Hun retaliation, and managing their competing interests demanded constant negotiation and careful distribution of anticipated benefits. The success of these diplomatic efforts demonstrated the extent to which the Hun king had evolved from tribal war leader to international statesman capable of coordinating complex political relationships. The Gallic campaign's preparation phase highlighted strategic shifts in nomadic combat that left a lasting mark on the art of war. Supply trains organized according to systematic plans supported operations far from traditional grazing territories, while intelligence networks provided detailed information about enemy positions and regional politics. Communication systems adapted from nomadic migration practices enabled coordination across vast distances that previous armies had found impossible to manage effectively. In early 451, this unprecedented force began moving westward across the Rhine, implementing an invasion strategy that combined traditional nomadic speed with systematic territorial conquest. Rather than random raiding or opportunistic plunder, the campaign followed predetermined objectives that reflected sophisticated understanding of Western political geography and military capabilities. Cities that controlled strategic routes or resources were targeted for capture, while others were bypassed or left for later consolidation. Metz, strategically positioned to control access to the Gallic interior, became the first major target of the invasion. Its rapid fall demonstrated the effectiveness of siege techniques that had been perfected during the Balkan campaigns, while the thoroughness of its destruction sent the intended message to other Gallic cities about the consequences of resistance. Refugees streaming southward from the burning city carried tales of devastation that began the psychological warfare campaign that often proved as effective as military assault. Rheims, Troy, and dozens of smaller cities fell in rapid succession as the invasion force swept through northeastern Gaul with speed that caught defending forces completely unprepared. Unlike previous barbarian raids that had been contained through local resistance and strategic withdrawal, this campaign maintained momentum through systematic planning and overwhelming force concentration. Each victory provided resources for further operations, while demonstrating to potential allies and enemies alike the futility of opposing Hun military power. News of the invasion's early successes created panic throughout the Western Empire as authorities struggled to organize effective resistance. The military resources available to Valentinian III were scattered across Africa, Spain, and Italy, engaged in conflicts with Vandals, Visigoths, and various other barbarian groups. Coordinating a response to the Gallic invasion required recalling forces from other fronts, creating vulnerabilities that threatened the security of the entire empire. Desperate circumstances forced imperial authorities to seek alliance with peoples who had previously been considered enemies. Visigothic King Theodoric, whose kingdom in southwestern Gaul faced direct threat from Hun expansion, proved willing to cooperate with the imperial forces he had fought for decades. This unlikely partnership reflected the recognition that Hun success would threaten the independence of all established powers in Gaul, barbarian and civilized alike. Aetius, the Western Empire's most capable general, assumed command of the allied forces that represented the last hope for stopping Attila's advance toward the heart of Gaul. His military reputation had been built through decades of frontier warfare against various barbarian enemies, but he had never faced an opponent with the resources and capabilities that the Hun king now commanded. The coming confrontation would test not just military skills, but the fundamental question of whether traditional Roman tactics could prevail against the evolved nomadic warfare that had conquered half of Europe. Strategic considerations that influenced Aetius's defensive planning reflected the complexity of the political situation in Gaul. Beyond simply stopping the Hun invasion, he needed to preserve the delicate balance between imperial authority and barbarian federate kingdoms that had maintained relative stability in the region for decades. Military victory that came at the cost of destroying this balance might prove as catastrophic as military defeat, leaving the empire unable to govern territories that had been saved from Hun conquest. Assembly of the allied army at Orléans demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of the coalition that Aetius had managed to organize. Imperial forces provided disciplined infantry and siege equipment, while Visigothic cavalry offered mobility and striking power that could match Hun tactics. Various smaller allied contingents contributed specialized capabilities and local knowledge that enhanced the army's overall effectiveness. However, coordinating these diverse elements in battle would require leadership skills that few commanders possessed. Attila's approach to Orléans revealed the strategic thinking that had made his campaigns so successful. Rather than attempting immediate assault on the city's formidable defenses, he implemented a siege strategy designed to force the allied army into battle, under conditions that favored Hun tactical advantages. The psychological pressure created by threatening Orléans forced Aetius to abandon defensive positions and seek engagement in open terrain, where nomadic mobility would prove most effective. When the siege of Orléans began, citizens and defenders alike understood that they faced a test that would determine the future of Gaul and possibly the entire Western Empire. The city's survival depended not just on the strength of its walls, but on the ability of the hastily assembled allied army to arrive in time to break the Hun blockade. Success or failure in the coming battle would determine whether Western Europe would follow the eastern provinces into submission to barbarian authority. On the fields of Gaul, the fate of Europe trembled between a dying empire and an unstoppable force. The greatest military confrontation of the 5th century was about to unfold, pitting the evolved tactics of nomadic warfare against the combined desperation of civilized and barbarian defenders. The outcome would determine whether Attila's vision of universal conquest could overcome the last organized resistance that the settled world could offer. The Eternal City braced for fire. But when Attila came, he did not conquer. He negotiated. A pale, frigid dawn rose over the Catalonian plains, where two vast armies stood poised on ground, destined to become the grave of empires. For hours, neither side moved, each waiting for the other to reveal weakness or make the first mistake. When the battle finally erupted, it unleashed violence on a scale that shocked even veterans of decades of frontier warfare. By sunset, the ground was carpeted with the dead of a dozen peoples, and neither Attila nor Aetius could claim decisive victory. King Theodoric of the Visigoths lay among the fallen, his death robbing the alliance of one of its most capable leaders while demonstrating the terrible cost of opposing Hun expansion. Thousands of warriors from across Europe had perished in a single afternoon, leaving both armies bloodied and exhausted. For the first time in his career, Attila faced a tactical situation where complete victory had proven impossible, forcing him to reassess strategies that had seemed invincible just hours earlier. Withdrawal from Gaul proceeded with the disciplined efficiency that had characterized all of the Hun king's military operations. Rather than admitting defeat or abandoning his territorial ambitions, he treated the battle as a temporary setback that provided valuable lessons about the limits of nomadic tactics against well-coordinated defensive alliances. The retreat itself became a strategic statement, demonstrating that even failure could be managed with dignity and preparation for future success. During the winter that followed the Gallic campaign, Attila devoted enormous energy to analyzing what had gone wrong at Chalons and how similar problems might be avoided in future operations. The battle had revealed vulnerabilities in Hun tactical systems when facing enemies who understood their methods and possessed adequate resources for organized resistance. More troubling, it had demonstrated that the psychological warfare that often decided Hun victories could be neutralized by opponents who refused to panic under pressure. Strategic reconsiderations emerging from this analysis led to fundamental changes in how the Hun Confederation approached territorial expansion. Rather than relying exclusively on rapid conquest and immediate submission, future campaigns would incorporate more systematic approaches to siege warfare, territorial consolidation, and political integration. The failure in Gaul had been educational, providing insights that would make subsequent operations more effective and less vulnerable to the kind of coordinated resistance that Aetius had managed to organize. By early 452, these strategic innovations were ready for testing against a target that offered both enormous potential rewards and significant tactical challenges. Italy beckoned with wealth that dwarfed anything available in Gaul, while the political situation in the peninsula suggested opportunities for the kind of sophisticated diplomatic manipulation that had proven so successful in the East. The Western Empire's capital at Ravenna controlled territories that, if conquered, would complete Attila's domination of the civilized world. Crossing the Alps in early spring demonstrated the logistical capabilities that the Hun Confederation had developed since its nomadic origins. Rather than simple tribal migrations, the invasion force moved according to predetermined schedules that coordinated the passage of enormous numbers of men, horses, and equipment through mountain terrain that had traditionally been considered impassable to large armies. Engineering knowledge acquired during previous campaigns enabled the construction of temporary bridges and road improvements that facilitated rapid movement across difficult country. Aquileia, the great fortress city that guarded the approaches to the Venetian plain, represented the first major test of Hun siege capabilities in Italy. Its massive walls and strategic position had protected northeastern Italy from barbarian assault for centuries, while its role as a major commercial center made it wealthy enough to finance prolonged resistance. Citizens who had watched distant wars with detached interest suddenly found themselves facing an enemy whose reputation for systematic destruction preceded him across the Alpine passes. Siege techniques employed against Aquileia revealed the technological innovations that had emerged from years of warfare against fortified positions. Traditional nomadic mobility was supplemented by sophisticated engineering equipment, operated by specialists recruited from conquered territories. The systematic approach to breaching operations reflected careful study of defensive architecture and siege methodology that transformed nomadic raiders into professional besiegers capable of reducing any fortification through patient application of overwhelming force. When Aquileia's walls finally fell after months of siege, The city's destruction exceeded even the thorough devastation that had characterized Hun operations in the Balkans. Every building was systematically demolished, every defensive work was eliminated, and the population was either killed or dispersed according to predetermined plans that left nothing for future reconstruction. The completeness of this destruction served notice to other Italian cities about the consequences of resistance while providing concrete benefits for the warriors who had participated in the siege. Refugees fleeing the ruins of Aquileia carried tales of destruction so complete that many who heard them sought safety in places that had never before required fortification. Among these refugees were families who would eventually find shelter in the lagoons and islands off the Venetian coast, establishing settlements that would grow into the maritime Republic of Venice. The destruction of one great city thus inadvertently led to the foundation of another, demonstrating the unpredictable long-term consequences of military campaigns. Milan, the former imperial capital and still one of the wealthiest cities in the West, fell to Hun assault with shocking speed. Rather than attempting prolonged resistance like Aquileia, the city's leaders chose negotiated surrender that preserved lives and property in exchange for enormous tribute payments and cooperation with nomadic administration. This precedent encouraged other Italian cities to seek accommodation rather than destruction, creating opportunities for political solutions that had been absent during the more brutal Balkan campaigns. Padua, Vicenza, and numerous smaller cities throughout the Po Valley experienced similar fates as the invasion force swept across northern Italy, with speed that left imperial authorities unable to organize effective resistance. Each victory demonstrated the futility of opposing Hun military power, while providing resources that sustained further operations. More importantly, the systematic nature of these conquests revealed strategic planning that aimed at permanent territorial control rather than temporary plunder. Imperial response to the Italian invasion reflected the complete exhaustion of Western military capabilities after decades of warfare against multiple barbarian enemies. Emperor Valentinian III, isolated in his capital at Ravenna, commanded forces that were inadequate for defending even the most crucial territories, while his generals lacked both the resources and the strategic vision necessary for confronting an enemy of Attila's caliber. Desperate appeals for assistance from the Eastern Empire received sympathetic responses but little practical support, as Constantinople was too concerned with its own security to risk military adventure in Italy. Political chaos in imperial administration compounded the military crisis as various court factions sought to position themselves advantageously for whatever accommodation might eventually be reached with the Hun king. Some advisors advocated complete submission and negotiated settlement, while others argued for desperate military resistance despite the obvious inadequacy of available forces. These internal divisions paralyzed decision-making at precisely the moment when decisive leadership was most essential for imperial survival. As Hun forces approached the outskirts of Rome itself, panic gripped the Eternal City in ways that had not been experienced since the sack by Alaric decades earlier. Citizens who had grown comfortable with imperial protection discovered that their security depended on negotiations with barbarian leaders, whose demands might exceed anything the empire could afford to pay. The approaching crisis forced Romans to confront the possibility that their 1,000-year dominance of the Mediterranean world might be ending. Among those who refused to accept this possibility was Pope Leo I, whose authority as leader of the Christian Church provided him with influence that exceeded that of most imperial officials. Rather than waiting for military defeat or political collapse, he chose to seek direct negotiation with Attila, gambling that personal diplomacy might achieve what military resistance had failed to accomplish. His decision to meet the Hun king represented both remarkable courage and sophisticated understanding of the political realities that now governed relations between civilized and barbarian powers. Encounter between the Pope and the Conqueror, which took place at the banks of the Po River north of Rome, became one of the most famous diplomatic meetings in European history. Contemporary accounts differ about the specific terms discussed, but all agree that the negotiations resulted in Attila's decision to withdraw from Italy without attempting to capture Rome itself. Whether this outcome reflected papal persuasion, practical considerations about the costs of urban siege warfare, or strategic calculations about long-term political advantages remains unclear. But the immediate result was the preservation of the ancient capital. Factors influencing Attila's decision to spare Rome extended beyond the immediate diplomatic encounter with Pope Leo. Intelligence reports indicated that plague was spreading through northern Italy, threatening to devastate his army if operations continued through the summer months. Additionally, news from the east suggested that imperial authorities in Constantinople were preparing military expeditions that might threaten Hun territories while his main forces were engaged in Italy. These practical considerations made withdrawal seem preferable to the risks associated with prolonged operations in an increasingly hostile environment. Strategic calculations that influenced the decision to retreat also reflected Attila's sophisticated understanding of the relationship between military conquest and political legitimacy. Destroying Rome might satisfy desires for revenge and provide enormous immediate plunder, but it would also eliminate a symbol whose preservation served his long-term interests better than its destruction. A Rome that survived under Hun protection offered possibilities for legitimizing nomadic authority that a Rome reduced to ruins could never provide. The retreat wasn't just strategic. It underscored how the Huns had developed a more structured economy, far removed from their raiding routes. The wealth already extracted from northern Italian cities exceeded anything that Rome itself could provide, while the costs of siege operations against the ancient capital would have been enormous. More importantly, the political benefits of voluntary withdrawal, demonstrating restraint and diplomatic sophistication, outweighed the marginal advantages that complete conquest might have offered. Return journey across the Alps proceeded with the same systematic efficiency that had characterized the invasion, though circumstances had changed significantly during the months of Italian operations. Plague that had begun in northern Italy spread to Hun forces, creating logistical challenges that required careful management to prevent the kind of military disaster that could destroy an army more effectively than enemy action. The successful management of this retreat under difficult conditions demonstrated organizational capabilities that rivaled the Confederation's battlefield achievements. Back in his royal camp along the Tisza, Attila spent the remainder of 452 consolidating the gains achieved through his Italian expedition, while planning future operations that would complete his domination of the Western Empire. The demonstration of Hun capability to strike at the heart of imperial territory had achieved strategic objectives that pure conquest might not have accomplished, while the diplomatic resolution of the campaign had preserved options that military destruction would have eliminated. Italy had been a laboratory for testing new approaches to territorial expansion that combined traditional nomadic strengths with innovations adapted to the requirements of governing settled populations. Standing at the gates of Rome and turning away represented not mercy, but strategy. The Hun king had demonstrated that no city in Europe, regardless of its historical significance or defensive capabilities, lay beyond the reach of his military power. More importantly, he had shown that this power could be exercised with restraint and diplomatic sophistication, that elevated him above the level of simple barbarian destroyer. The master of the steppes had proven himself capable of statesmanship that rivaled anything the civilized world could offer, while retaining the military capabilities that made his political pronouncements impossible to ignore. From the banks of the Po to the palaces of Constantinople, rulers now understood that Attila's authority extended wherever his armies could reach. The Italian campaign had been a demonstration rather than a conquest, a proof of concept that established new parameters for European politics. The barbarian who had spared Rome commanded more respect than those who might have sacked it, having proven that true power lay not in destruction, but in the ability to choose between destruction and preservation, according to strategic calculations that lesser leaders could neither understand nor implement. The stars hung motionless over the Hungarian plains that night, as if even the cosmos paused to mark the end of a life that had shaken empires. In a great wooden hall hung with silks from Constantinople and golden treasures torn from a dozen conquered cities, Attila lay dead beside his newest bride, a Germanic girl named Ildiko, whose beauty had captivated the conqueror in what would prove to be his final political alliance. The king, who had made emperors tremble, had been felled not by enemy sword or assassin's blade, but by his own blood, which had burst from his throat in a crimson torrent that no physician could staunch. Circumstances surrounding the death would spawn legends that outlived the empire he had built. Some whispered of poison administered by Byzantine agents who had finally found a way to eliminate their greatest enemy. Others spoke of divine judgment upon a man who had claimed dominion over territories that belonged to God alone. Most likely, the 60-year-old conqueror had simply succumbed to the accumulated stresses of a lifetime spent in the saddle, his body betraying him at the moment when his power seemed most secure. When dawn revealed the motionless form of the man who had terrorized half the known world, his followers faced a crisis that threatened to destroy everything he had built. For 30 years, the Hun Confederation had expanded through the force of one man's personality, held together by personal loyalty to a leader whose vision and ruthlessness had transformed scattered nomadic tribes into the dominant power in Europe. Without Attila's unifying presence, the vast alliance of peoples and territories he had assembled began to fracture along the ethnic and tribal lines that had been temporarily suppressed by shared success. Funeral rites for the fallen king combined nomadic traditions with innovations that reflected his unique status in the barbarian world. According to the historian Jordanes, the body was encased in 3 coffins, one of gold, one of silver, and one of iron, symbolizing the treasures he had extracted from the civilized world and the strength that had made such extraction possible. The burial ceremony itself took place in secrecy, with the gravediggers reportedly killed to ensure that the location would never be revealed to enemies who might seek to desecrate his remains. Legend claims that the burial took place beneath a riverbed, with waters diverted during the interment and then allowed to flow back over the grave, making it impossible for future generations to locate the exact spot where the scourge of God lay at rest. Whether this account reflects historical fact or mythological embellishment, it captures the determination of his followers to protect their fallen leader even in death, ensuring that his memory would remain unblemished by the degradations that time and enemies might otherwise inflict. Among Attila's sons, who had been groomed for leadership throughout their father's reign, competition for succession erupted almost immediately after the funeral rites concluded. Elak, the eldest, claimed authority over the confederation based on traditional nomadic inheritance practices, while his brothers Dengizic and Ernak disputed his right to rule the diverse empire their father had assembled. Each son commanded the loyalty of different tribal groups, and had developed distinct approaches to the challenges of governing settled and nomadic populations across vast territories. These succession disputes revealed fundamental tensions within the Confederation that Attila's personal authority had concealed but never resolved. Germanic allies who had joined the Hun cause for specific military campaigns now questioned their obligations to leaders they had never personally acknowledged. Slavic tribes that had been incorporated into the Confederation through conquest began asserting independence from nomadic overlords whose legitimacy had derived entirely from their association with the dead king. Most seriously, the Ostrogothic and Gepid kingdoms that formed the Confederation's military backbone started positioning themselves as independent powers rather than subordinate allies. Revolt began among the Gepids under King Ardaric, who had been one of Attila's most trusted lieutenants, but refused to accept subordination to any of his sons. Ardaric's rebellion provided a rallying point for other subject peoples who saw an opportunity to escape nomadic domination, while the Hun leadership remained paralyzed by internal conflicts. Within months of the Great King's death, what had been the most formidable military alliance in European history was fragmenting into competing factions that viewed each other with suspicion and hostility. Battle of Nidau in 454 became the decisive confrontation that determined the fate of Attila's empire. Forces loyal to his sons faced a coalition of former allies led by Ardaric, whose superior knowledge of Hun military methods enabled him to counter the tactical advantages that had made nomadic armies so successful. The irony was bitter. The Confederation that had conquered through superior organization and battlefield innovation was destroyed by enemies who had learned those same techniques through years of cooperation and shared military campaigns. Defeat at Nidau shattered what remained of Hun military power in Central Europe. Elac died in the fighting, while his surviving brothers found themselves reduced to leading refugee bands rather than governing territories. The great royal camp along the Tisza was abandoned as former subjects divided the treasures that had been accumulated through decades of conquest and tribute extraction. Warriors who had followed Attila from victory to victory scattered in search of new leaders and new opportunities, in a world where Hun dominance had suddenly become a memory rather than a reality. Consequences of the Confederation's collapse extended far beyond the immediate military disaster. Throughout the former Hun territories, power vacuums emerged that would reshape European political geography for centuries. Ostrogothic kingdoms established themselves in regions that would later become Italy and the Balkans, while various Germanic tribes occupied territories in what would become Germany and Eastern Europe. The carefully balanced system of tribute and alliance that had sustained Hun dominance was replaced by chaos that took generations to resolve. Subject peoples who had been incorporated into Attila's empire found themselves abandoned to face imperial retaliation without the protection that nomadic military power had previously provided. Some communities that had prospered under Hun rule discovered that their former imperial overlords remembered their cooperation with barbarian authorities and were prepared to exact revenge for perceived betrayals. The transition from nomadic to imperial authority proved as traumatic for many populations as the original conquest had been. Surviving members of Attila's family faced fates that reflected the complete reversal of Hun fortunes after Nidau. Dengizic attempted to maintain an independent kingdom north of the Danube, but was eventually killed by imperial forces that no longer feared nomadic retaliation. Ernak found refuge within the Eastern Empire, where his descendants would serve as mercenary commanders and eventually be absorbed into the imperial military hierarchy. The bloodline that had dominated Europe became a footnote in the service records of the powers their ancestor had humbled. Imperial reaction to news of Attila's death and the subsequent collapse of his confederation revealed both relief and concern about the changing balance of power in Europe. Emperor Marcian in Constantinople reportedly declared a day of celebration, while officials throughout the empire struggled to adapt policies that had been designed around the assumption of continuing Hun pressure. The tribute payments that had drained imperial treasuries could finally be discontinued. But the political structures that had emerged in response to nomadic dominance would prove difficult to modify. More troubling for long-term imperial security was the realization that Attila's death had not restored the pre-Hun status quo in barbarian Europe. The Germanic kingdoms that had gained strength and territorial control through association with the Confederation retained their enhanced power even after nomadic authority collapsed. Visigothic, Ostrogothic, and Vandal states now controlled territories that had previously been under direct imperial administration, creating new challenges that would prove as difficult to manage as Hun expansion had been. Economic disruption caused by the Confederation's collapse affected trade networks that had developed during the period of nomadic dominance. Commercial relationships that had flourished under Hun protection became vulnerable to the warfare and political instability that followed the power vacuum left by Attila's death. Merchants who had grown wealthy, facilitating trade between nomadic territories and imperial cities, found their business models obsolete in a world where political fragmentation replaced the unified authority that had guaranteed safe passage across vast distances. Cultural legacy of the Hun Confederation proved more durable than its political and military achievements. Artistic traditions, architectural techniques, and administrative practices that had been developed through the synthesis of nomadic and settled cultures continued to influence regional development long after the political structures that had created them disappeared. The cosmopolitan court culture that had characterized Attila's reign left traces in the customs and institutions of successor kingdoms throughout Central and Eastern Europe. Stories of Attila's achievements spread far beyond the territories he had directly controlled, inspiring both admiration and terror in peoples who had never experienced Hun rule. Germanic oral traditions preserved accounts of his conquests that would eventually be incorporated into medieval literature, while Byzantine historians recorded detailed analyses of his military and political methods. The man who had been a contemporary threat became a historical figure whose reputation exceeded the actual scope of his accomplishments. The legacy of the Huns' peak years can still be seen in the wealth and infrastructure that once defined their dominion. Hoards of gold and silver objects, many bearing influences from multiple cultural traditions, testify to the wealth that had flowed through nomadic trade networks. Fortification systems and settlement patterns show how local populations had adapted to the requirements of living under nomadic authority while maintaining their traditional economic and social structures. Within a generation of Attila's death, the memory of Hun dominance had already begun to acquire mythological dimensions that obscured the historical realities of nomadic rule. Stories told by survivors emphasized the most dramatic aspects of conquest and destruction, while minimizing the administrative innovations and diplomatic achievements that had made such conquests sustainable. The complex political entity that Attila had created was simplified in popular memory into a narrative of barbarian terror and civilized resistance. By 500 AD, less than 50 years after the Great King's death, the Hun Confederation had become a historical curiosity rather than a living political reality. New powers had emerged to fill the vacuum left by nomadic collapse, while the territories that had once acknowledged Attila's authority were divided among kingdoms that traced their legitimacy to completely different sources. The speed of this transformation demonstrated both the personal nature of nomadic authority and the resilience of the underlying economic and social structures that survived political upheaval. Legacy that endured beyond the immediate political consequences of the Confederation's collapse was Attila's demonstration that traditional assumptions about the relationship between civilized and barbarian societies were no longer valid. His success in creating effective administrative systems, maintaining diplomatic relationships, and governing diverse populations had proven that nomadic societies could adapt to the requirements of territorial empire without abandoning their essential character. This precedent would influence the development of later nomadic empires across Eurasia for centuries. Standing at his grave, wherever it might lie beneath the Hungarian soil, one can sense the enormity of what died with him on that spring night in 453. The vision of a unified Europe under nomadic authority, the possibility of permanent synthesis between settled and mobile societies, the dream of conquest that knew no boundaries, save those imposed by geography itself. All these perished when Attila's heart stopped beating. Europe would never again face a barbarian threat of comparable scope and sophistication, nor would it see another leader who combined nomadic heritage with civilized ambition so effectively. His empire vanished like mist at dawn, but his name rode on, like thunder across the steppes, in the courts of kings who never knew his rule, in the songs of peoples whose ancestors had fled his armies, in the nightmares of emperors who feared that another such conqueror might someday emerge from the eastern darkness. Attila's memory persisted long after his political achievements had crumbled into dust. The scourge of God had become immortal through the terror he had inspired, and the impossible dream he had almost achieved. The dream of making the entire world bow before the will of a single man who had learned to read empires like a hunter reads prey, and who had discovered that even the mightiest civilizations were no more permanent than the morning frost.